morning, everyone. I believe that we're live in the Business Analyst Success Path. I am Sarabjit. I am coming to you live with training. So if you guys have real-time questions while this training, the topic for this training topic is requirements estimation. Again, we work and I train on IT projects only. So if there's any other interest that you're, interested in, business analysis or project management outside of IT projects, I have no clue. So you're probably better off in some other group, not this one. What we cover in this group is IT projects, primarily business analysis. And today's topic is how do you estimate IT projects, right? So we'll talk about those in the waterfall environment as well as the agile environment. If you have real-time questions, I am in a Zoom meeting. So if you go into the events area, you will see today's training topic as well as the Zoom link. You can join me here on Zoom for live questions. And the goal of these training sessions is that you get real live training, so you can ask me questions anytime. But if you're watching this in our Business Analyst Success Path group, you can also leave comments in the comments area below, and I can get to them at a later point. I can also try to juggle monitoring your questions in the group, but it becomes a little difficult to do both. So let's get this started. So again, the goal and the topic for today's training topic is how do you estimate requirements? We'll go over the Agile, the waterfall environment, as well as Agile, and I'll show you how I've done it. Again, this group and all of my training is practical, hands-on experience, none of the book stuff. There's many different ways of accomplishing this. What I teach you is what I myself have practiced and what I've seen in the industry for over the past 15 years. Okay, guys, again, I posted in the group again yesterday, what should the training topics be? I'm open to any training topics that you guys are curious about. Let me see how I can present this. So if there's a topic or a burning question inside of you that you want to know about, requirements estimation efforts, this was a topic that somebody in the group had mentioned, so we're doing training on this. Every week, I do live training for you guys, but you guys got to tell me what topics or what questions you have so that I can prepare training around them. I usually need like 1 day advance, maybe an hour or so to create the training materials. But again, I need to know what topics are of interest to you guys. So again, if you can let me know in the comments in our group, let me know in any way that is helpful for you what burning questions you have. So today's training topic is requirements estimation effort. This is, again, we're talking about IT projects. There are two major ways that IT projects are implemented. The first one being waterfall, the second one being agile. And I'll show you how how you estimate how much IT projects are going to cost, right, in both scenarios. So the goal is, let's first talk about waterfall. This is a little blurry. It didn't look as blurry when I copied it from Google. If you guys have been in this group for a long time, you know that Google is my best friend and should be your best friend as well. So you never want to recreate the wheel. You try to always use for guidance anything that's available out there. So what this shows you is in managing IT projects, I mentioned that there's two different ways you can manage IT projects, waterfall and agile. This is the waterfall method, which means that everything happens linear, right? So first you gather the requirements, then you do design. Actually, there's a planning session ahead of requirements. So you do planning, requirements, design, development, which is coding, programming, testing, deployment, which is when you go live, and then there's a maintenance phase. So typically when you're working in a waterfall environment, in the planning phase, there's something called a project charter. So if you don't have a project charter, you don't really have a project. And in that project charter, you identify the high-level scope, timelines, and budget. And the way that you identify the budget for the project is because you do a level 0 estimate. So when you're working on a project in the waterfall scenario, let me show you. So in the waterfall scenario, this is what we typically see. We see pre-planning, planning, analysis, design, coding, testing, and implementation, which is similar to what the previous slide had. But the things that you see identified in yellow are where you're going to be doing your estimates. And typically business analysts don't do the estimates is typically the majority of the cost for IT project is the coding and the development work, right? So typically what you do is when you're in the planning phase, when you're working on a project charter, sometimes BAs do work on the project charter, sometimes BAs do not. Again, it all goes back to what type of organization you're in and what, how that organization functions. So I've seen BAs doing project charters, and I've seen BAs being handed a project charter to work on a project. Okay, so if you are doing a project charter, you are given the high level scope, you are given the high level timelines, and you are given a high level budget. The budget comes from understanding what the high level scope is and moving that high level scope around to your IT teams, to your development teams, and your QA teams, and say, can you, based on this high level estimate, give us a level 0 estimate on how much this project is going to cost? Okay, so once you have your development and QA timeframes or cost, then you can build in your BA and your PM expenses, which is typically not as expensive as your development cost. Okay, so once you have your level 0 estimate, we also call it SWOT, there's many different terms that are used here, but I'm going to just stick with level 0 estimate, which is again a very, very high level estimate of how much this project that you're working on is going to cost. Then you go into the analysis phase. This is where, as business analysts, you guys will be working on and developing a business requirements document. So when you're developing a business requirements document, it includes your functional requirements, it includes your non-functional requirements, it includes your prototyping, right? As again, high-level prototyping, it includes your workflows. And once you work with your stakeholders to identify exactly how this project should happen, not exactly how to do it, but what this project needs to do, that's when, once those requirements are completed, again, you send those requirements to your IT teams, meaning your development and your QA teams, to do a detailed level cost estimate, right? So at that time, you have a much better cost estimate on how much this project is going to cost rather than your level 0 estimate. So those in the waterfall environment are the two areas where you would be seeing project estimates. I'm going to pause here to see if I have any comments in the chat area. Okay, Brema, no worries. If you have questions, put them in the chat area for people in the group. Let's see if you guys have any questions in the comments area. I don't see any as of now, and I'll continue to monitor this as we go along. So what I just talked about was the waterfall environment. Now let's move on to Agile. So the Agile framework at a glance. This seems a little blurry to me again, but the general consensus of the difference between waterfall and Agile is, with waterfall, everything is linear. As I explained a little bit earlier, you finish planning, then you start requirements, then you start design and development, and so on. So it's very, very linear. So if you make a mistake or if there's confusion, it's very difficult to go back and fix those things. Those things happen in the waterfall environment, but they require something called a change request, because everything has to be formal and documented and signed off in the waterfall environment. In the Agile gives you a little bit of a flexibility when managing and completing IT projects, right? Because what we have is, instead of working with many different stakeholders, BAs typically have to work with many different stakeholders in the waterfall environment. Primarily in Agile, your Scrum Master / business analyst is working with a product owner who then is interfacing with many of the different stakeholders. So there's a little bit of a shift of responsibility, and it is your product owner that is typically providing you with prioritization and things that need to happen next on the project, right? So in the Agile environment, typically your teams are maybe 5 to 7 people, right? So you have your product owner, you have your Scrum Master, you have 2 or 3 developers, you have a QA person, you may have a UX designer as well as part of your team, but the teams are very, very small. And as a team, everybody collaborates on what things should happen in the next sprint. So if you are not familiar with how Agile works, there's many, many different trainings that we've done in the past. that you can find and, kind of have a bearing on how Agile works. For now, we're going to focus on how do you do estimating on, the requirements. So I'm going to, again, just give you guys a very, very high level overview of Agile, and then I'll continue to tell you how we estimate our requirements. So in the Agile environment, again, you're typically primarily interfacing with your product owner and your internal team to refine the backlog, right? You're creating user stories. User stories is a way to document requirements. There's a different format of how user stories are written so that they're customer centric and that you are able to test them towards the end of the sprint. Any work that's done, so typically in the waterfall environment, you're releasing product every 6 to 18 months, right? Because you have to do the linear approach. You're doing everything, all the requirements in one shot. In the Agile, you're doing small pieces of functionality, right? Every 2 to 4 weeks. And that's another primary difference between waterfall and Agile. So typically when you're delivering functionality, it's in a sprint cycle. So this is the product backlog may have many, many, many different requirements. Your sprint planning is where your requirements estimation takes place. After you've estimated your requirements, you put them in something called a sprint backlog. So that may have like 5 or 6 features, not features, but functionality that are deliverable to the customer. So you work on them. This is called the sprint cycle. So again, could be anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. I've typically seen 2 to 4 weeks. 1 week sprint cycle is just too short to deliver any working functionality. So I've typically seen 2 to 4 week sprint cycles, sometimes longer, but typically 2 to 4. So once that functionality is delivered, you do testing on it, and then you have a sprint review, you have demos with your stakeholders, and you identify what the next steps are. So again, that was Agile in a nutshell. Now let's move on and talk about how do you estimate in the Agile environment. Okay, so as I mentioned when I started this training, there's many, many, many different ways on how you do estimating in the Agile environment, right? What I'm most familiar with and what I've used in my day-to-day is the method that I'm going to talk about. Let's get into it. Okay. So typically when you're writing user stories, right, user stories are supposed to be, one piece of functionality, right? So when you're creating user stories, they're typically in a format as a user, I want to do X so that something else, right? And they're written in a way that you can, the developers can very easily understand that me as a user of whatever system wants to accomplish this task so that I can do my reporting or so that I can understand if there's something wrong with the system. So they're written in a way from a user standpoint to deliver one piece of functionality at a time. Okay, so when typically we're in sprint planning, before you enter sprint planning, your product owner and your Scrum Master should have a pretty refined product backlog. That's where what a refined product backlog means that they have X number of user stories that are very complete, that have a lot of the detail, meaning that they've given you, in the format that I just talked about. As a user, I want to do X so that something else can happen. They also have your, acceptance criteria as part of the user story, because that's the only way our QA folks at the end of this, when our developers are creating it, will know how to test this functionality, right? So typically, before you go into your sprint planning, which is right here, as a team, so before you go into your sprint planning, your product owner and your Scrum Master should have some user stories, X number of user stories that are pretty refined and prioritized. So when we go into the sprint planning meeting, we as a team look at the high priority user stories, right? So the product owner will typically present to the team the high priority user stories. We talk about each of the user stories, and we, talk about the risk, the complexity, the dependencies for the user stories, right? At that point, what we do is we look to our developers to assign level of effort in story points. For us internally, we assign half a day to 1 point. A full day is 2 story points. So once we discuss that user story in terms of risk, complexity, dependencies internally, is when we'll look to our developers and say, okay, we typically have full stack developers on our team, some people that focus primarily on the front end functionality, some developers that focus primarily on the back end of the functionality. But regardless, we try to split those things up, user stories that are impacting just the front end, and then user stories that are just impacting the back end, so that there's no crossover, right? So once we've discussed the user story internally, we look to our developers and say, okay, how much time do you think that this is going to cost you to build out? And then at that point, we assign level of effort or story points to our user stories. So I'll pause there to see if there's any questions before I continue. None in Zoom. Let me make sure there's not any in the group. I have one comment. Okay, so the question in the group is the acceptance criteria equal to expected test result? Yeah. So your acceptance criteria is your expected test result. You typically put that as part of the user story so that when our developers as well as our QA folks on the team have finished coding something, they know what the end result should look like. So yes, the answer is your acceptance criteria is your expected result. Okay. All right. So with that, so once you understand how many story points X number of user stories are, at that point you try to determine, what goes into a particular sprint, right? There's something called a team velocity. Team velocity, all team velocity means is how many story points can your team fit into a sprint, and that is different from every team. It's different from by organization. It's actually very different per the team that you're working on. I see there's a comment. Just give me 1 second. Prema says, whose responsibility to create the user stories in Agile? Is it by BA alone through requirements elicitation, or is it a team effort with product owner and Scrum Master? So actually, Prema, there's really no role called a BA or a business analyst in the Agile environment. That role is typically, taken over by the Scrum Master, right? Scrum Master is typically the person that is helping the product owner in writing user stories. So the book definition is that the product owner plus the entire team should be the ones writing user stories. But from a business standpoint, just because the product owner is the one interfacing with the different stakeholders like marketing teams, accounting teams, or whoever's impacted by this project, it is typically the product owner that's writing user stories with the help of a Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master can help the product owner in meetings with the stakeholders, understanding the requirements through elicitation, interviews, prototyping, and then writing those user stories. Now, when you hear that the entire team can write user stories, that comes into play when developers see that there's something, piece of functionality that needs to be created before we deliver the front end functionality. So that's where your developers will also go in and write user stories. So then what that means is that entire team essentially is responsible for writing user stories that end up in the product backlog. So there's another question there. Is it necessary to follow a certain format while writing the acceptance criteria? I would say not typically, but typically what we do is, we write the acceptance criteria just based on the functionality we're delivering. So let's say if we're delivering the registration page for a website or for a system. So the acceptance criteria is that the user should be able to log in successfully, enter username, password, should have a validation method, um, and have like password requirements like 8 characters, uppercase, lowercase, things like that. So typically there's really, for the acceptance criteria, I've seen people write, uh, given that a user is able to log in, um, so given then so that is a format that typically people use, but in our teams we just jot down what the expected result should be. But I think it's given that I'm a user, so it's a given, then I'll put it in the group. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a way that you can formally write your acceptance criteria. So I'll put that in the group. It's not coming to me off the top of my head. In our teams, we just jot down what should happen as a result of this user story being completed. There's another question from Preeti. What kind of documentation is done by BA in Agile then? So the documentation that's done, again, there's really no role of a BA. It's usually the Scrum Master, is the user stories that you're working on with the developers to develop. So typically it's the product backlog, which includes the user stories. That's the extent of the documentation that is done by the Agile teams. Let me see if there's another question. Trying to understand BA role in Agile environment. If product owner, Scrum Master, and developer are responsible to come up with the user stories, what is the responsibility BA holds in Agile? So there again, typically there's no BA in the Agile environment. Many teams do have business analysts plus Scrum Master, but your goal as a BA becomes when you're looking at user stories and making sure that they're complete, right? Your product owner typically has extensive business experience, right? So they may have been in the company, they're probably very influential, right? So they have lots of relationship with, good working relationships with your stakeholders. So your primary role as a Scrum Master / BA becomes to becomes making sure that those user stories are complete, right? So I've seen people write user stories that say, make sure, given that I'm a new user to X, I want to be able to register on the site. That's a huge feature, right? There's so many different user stories under that. So your role as a business analyst or a Scrum Master become making sure that the user stories that are written, that are going to be developed, are clear and small enough, right? Typically, your user stories you want to equate to a small piece of functionality that can be tested and delivered to your business stakeholders. The goal of Agile is speed to market, which means that you want to deliver small pieces of incremental functionality that would help you speed to market instead of waiting 6 to 18 months in the waterfall scenario. Does that make sense, Prima and Preeti? I hope that I've answered your questions, and if I haven't, put them back in there. And while you're doing that, let me check in the group to see if there's any more questions or comments in the group. Okay, no more questions in the group. Okay, awesome. So in the sprint planning, we're looking at our high priority user stories. Your team shouldn't go into sprint planning unless your user stories are defined enough, right? Because you don't want to waste the team's time, meaning developers, QA, Scrum Master, product owner, unless you have predefined user stories, which are baked and everybody understands what functionality those user stories are addressing. So in the sprint planning meeting, you're looking at your high priority user stories, you're determining story points by the dev teams, right? And then you're understanding your team velocity. Team velocity is how many story points can you as a team fit into your sprint, which it could be 2 weeks to 4 weeks typically. And the way that I do this today is I create an Excel spreadsheet, and for all the user stories that we want to put in a sprint, I put in how many story points it is per feature. And then at the end of it, it's just a multiplication. So if I have 5 programmers on the team and they're able to take on the user stories, divide them up, I just add those, divide by the number of story points to make sure that I get a number of mathematically that can fit into a sprint. That's typically how I do it today. Again, team velocity, which is the number of story points that your team can deliver, varies from team to team, right? So you have to watch and figure out what your personal team's velocity is before you would put X number of story points in there. Now, let's say if you're a brand new team, you don't know what the velocity is. Velocity you can figure out after like working with the team for 2 to 3 sprints, right? So you just have to be a little bit flexible. If you're working on your first sprint with a new team, you could, try to figure out, let's say if you can only do 20 story points for the first release, and at the end of the release, you realize your team can only handle 15, then the next time, the next sprint cycle planning session, you would only allocate 15 story points. But that in that, if you find that they're finishing the development work and the testing work before the sprint is over, then the following sprint, then you would try to do maybe 18 story points. So again, it's figuring out how much functionality your team can deliver, and it's just it becomes mathematical after a few sprints. But in the beginning, you just have to gauge how your team is performing. So that's how you determine that. And then the last one is determine which user stories are added to the product sprint backlog, which is again, based on let's say if you're a team, you can only accept 20 story points, and you have to go back to the high priority items to figure out which of those user stories you're going to add to the product backlog. Once things are added to the product backlog, I'm going to go back a slide over here. That's when your sprint cycle starts. And typically sprint planning should not take you more than 4 hours to do, right? Because your user stories are defined already. You're only trying to figure out level of effort and what to put into the sprint backlog. Okay, so that's the end of my slides. What questions do you guys have for me? So what we covered is how do you estimate IT projects in the waterfall environment as well as the Scrum environment. Any questions for me? Let me really quickly check in Facebook as well. And I will post the format for the test criteria in our group after this training. Okay, is that all? All right then, you guys, it's a wrap then for this week. Again, any topics that you're interested in learning more about, put them in the group and we'll cover them at some point. Okay, and that's it then. Let me stop sharing my screen. I hope you guys found this helpful. Let me know if there's any other topics for us to talk about. One more question, I think. Whose responsibility to approve user stories? Is it so when you say approve user stories, I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean to add product user stories to the product backlog? Because really there's no approval or denial of user stories, right? So user stories come from other stakeholders, right? So let's say this project is impacting our accounting teams or billing teams or account receivable. So the user stories typically would come from stakeholders through the product owner, because the product owner typically has those relationships and is gathering those user stories for us, right? So whether they get added to the product backlog, there's no approval process at all. What you would have is prioritization from the product owner to say, okay, well, we do have this user story, but it's a lower priority. So that would happen much later in the project. And other high priority items would happen much sooner based on sprint planning and the prioritization of those user stories. So I mean to validate where once it's delivered. Is that your question, Prema? I'll wait for her to type. So the question is, who is product owner and whose responsibility to approve user stories? And I think the question is, who validates once the user stories are done? Is that it? Prioritization is typically only done by the product owner. So let's say that we have user stories that now have been completed and we're ready to deliver. We have something called a demo at the end of the release, where we show our business stakeholders functionality that we've delivered. So the product owner sometimes will include or invite stakeholders to the demo to see if that functionality is acceptable. Sometimes, most of the time it is, and that's why another reason why you guys Agile is so successful, because our stakeholders are seeing the functionality that we're delivering, and are approving and are knowing what they're going to get, what the final end product is going to look like. As opposed to Waterfall, they don't really see the working prototype until they're in UAT. So that's again, the distinction between Agile and Waterfall is that your stakeholders get to see, small deliverable pieces of functionality at the demo. Preeti says prioritization is done by the PO only. Yes. Yeah. Typically, your product owner is the one typically who's determining from a business standpoint what is high priority. But our developers, let's say if there's a defect or there's piece of functionality like the technical things that need to happen, those need to happen before we can start building. Like the technical architecture needs to be laid out. All that stuff has to happen before we can start building onto the business functionality. Okay, more questions here, you guys. Give me 1 second. Let me read them. What if new features are being asked to be included in the same sprint? Then who makes the decision of including them in the sprint based on priority? So once you start working on a sprint, you never typically add anything to the sprint unless it's a bug or something, right? So if new functionality is being requested by the product owner or stakeholders, right, and is really, really high important, you typically would work to add those to the product backlog, and then in the next sprint, bring them into the sprint backlog. You typically don't want to confuse your team, right? So once you do the sprint planning, you decide that there's 10 user stories that we're going to do. We're only going to focus on those 10 user stories. You're never typically going to add anything else to the sprint once the work has started, right? Because what happens is if we were to add functionality at that time, the team has to stop, pause, figure out what else needs to be done, and that's wasted time. You don't typically want to do that unless there's a critical bug that we need to fix right away. At that time, you would introduce something new to the team, but you never really want to introduce anything once the sprint has started. Now, let's say the team is working on something, there's high priority, requirements or user stories that come in from one of the stakeholders. You'd work with the product owner to define it, right? Understand exactly what it is that we need to deliver, add it to the product backlog as a high priority item. So when we're doing sprint planning for the next sprint, that's when we can add it to the next sprint. So typically we don't want to introduce anything new once the sprint has started. Preeti, does that answer your question? These are all really, really, really good questions, you guys. Really good. Great job. Okay. And if you guys have more questions, please put them in the comments in the group. I will get to them. And again, any other topics, it's easy for me to create these trainings, but it's hard for me to figure out what you guys need. So please help me out and let me know what training topics are helpful to you guys. And I'm more than happy to provide that training. So that the sprint is not really agile, laughing out loud. Okay, yes, thanks. So yeah, the sprint itself for the 2 weeks is not agile because that functionality that we're delivering is locked down. And that's done for the benefit of the entire project, not just, to be agile and flexible. But again, if there are bugs, we can add them, but typically nothing else. Okay, awesome. Great, you guys. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of this group. If you're new to this group, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of training topics that we've covered in this in the past weeks. I typically try to do one training session a week. So we've covered lots of things. If you're new to the group, go back and watch them. If you've been here for a while, thank you for hanging out with me. It really is a pleasure to serve you. And with that, I'm done for the weekend. Bye, guys. Have a great rest of the Sunday wherever you are. I know some of you guys, it's pretty late, and I appreciate that you guys stay on with me to watch these training sessions. For some of you guys, it's the start of Sunday, just like me. So I'm going to go out and spend some time with my kids. I'll see you guys again next week. Take care. Bye. And be safe. You guys be safe out there. Bye.